The house was old, but sturdy. The old man flicked a switch and a dim light illuminated the narrow steps. The stairs went down steeply, and we started cautiously down one by one into the basement. The old man, the landlord, was the first to go, followed by me. Ahead of us it grew lighter, and here we were already standing on the granite-tiled floor in a narrow spot of daylight falling through a small window just above our heads. A pleasant coolness enveloped my body. I even thought I felt a slight breeze. It's an antique ventilation system. Do you feel a draft? As if the old man heard my thoughts. I turned to him. It's a nice basement, big and dry. It's decided I'm buying the house. Well, let's go upstairs and sign the necessary documents. The notary is waiting. It's okay. He can wait. It's his job to wait. We took our time going upstairs. In the hall, the notary was waiting patiently. The old man signed the deed of gift. I gave the agreed amount. The notary certified the receipt of money, and I became the owner of an old 2-story house in the old part of town. I must say that real estate in this area was expensive, so it was great luck to buy a house here for quite modest money. I liked the old architecture. I often came here and wandered through the narrow streets, and one day I met the old man. We sat down on one of the many benches and got to talking. Without knowing why, I told him about my troubles. He listened to me attentively, and then invited me in for tea. That's how I first saw this house. I saw it and fell in love. It was as if the old man read my mind. He told me that his children had gone away, and he lived here alone. The house is big, and it is difficult for him to maintain it properly. Then he was quiet for a while and suddenly offered to buy the house for me. I didn't hesitate for a second. The amount was acceptable, below the market price, and I had the money. Only I asked him to issue a deed of gift to me, so no one else cannot claim in the future to my purchase. I got the house with all the furnishings, antique furniture, clocks, fixtures. On the second floor was a bedroom and a study. They had doors from the large living room. The first floor was the kitchen, a bathroom, and a huge hall. Finally, there was the basement, dry and cool. I've been nurturing the idea of opening my own antique store for a long time. And buying this house in the old historic part of town was just at the right time. The notary received the fee and left, and my cell phone beeped. Where are you? My wife always starts the conversation with this stupid question, as if my whereabouts were of paramount importance to her. Lunch. Did you want something, darling? I tried to make my voice soft. I'm going to be late tonight. It's Tamara's birthday, and I'm going with the girls to congratulate her. She spoke in her usual short-spoken voice. Shall I pick you up? I asked a routine question. No, I'd rather you supervise Talik. Watch his math with him. He has a test soon. Kisses. She passed out. I'm lucky with Vika, a model wife, mother, and hostess, who always has everything under control. When I got home, my son had already eaten dinner and was at his computer. How are the lessons ready? He mumbled something without taking his eyes off the screen. Lately, my persistent attempts to find a common language with him had been unsuccessful. And, interestingly enough, my reluctance to communicate with me was fully supported by my wife. I sometimes felt that she was purposely turned my son against me. But I soon learned the reason for this behavior of my son and made no more attempts to get close to him. Until 6 months ago, my family life seemed to me clear and unclouded. With Vika, my wife, I had been married for 16 years. We got married when I was 22, she was 20. The initiative to enter into marriage belongs entirely to her. After 6 months of sluggish communication with me, Vika as if switched. She constantly called, almost forcibly imposing her society on me. She became friends with my mother and came into our house. It got to the point that my mom was persistently advising me not to break and quickly make a proposal to such a wonderful girl. She went to visit Vicky's parents, and her decision to marry us has become even stronger. They convinced me that one shouldn't look for the good from the evil, and I proposed to Vika. Needless to say, she immediately agreed to be my wife, and 3 months later we were married. But my father was not attracted to Vika. But he preferred to be silent and stay out of women's matrimonial affairs, watching the process of seducing his own son from the sidelines. When we got married, Vika was already 2 months pregnant. As a decent man, I just had to marry her. And 7 months later, Talik was born. Together, my parents bought us a 2-room apartment, so there were no problems with everyday life. For the first 5 years, everything was great. I am an art historian by profession. After 8 years of work in a museum, I suddenly got a job in a big antiques firm. I was engaged in the examination of parallel consulting collectors and gaining practical experience in this business. After a while, I had my own circle of regular customers, among whom I enjoyed a certain authority. Vika was working in a real estate firm, and Talik was growing up. The more he grew up, the less he looked like me. I did not discuss the issue with Vika, afraid to inadvertently offend his wife. But with his mother explained, but my mother waved her hands. Anything happens, the child may not be like his father. I wonder who he can be like, a neighbor. But that does not mean that he is not my son. And anyway, Vitaly, don't mess with my head, and don't you dare traumatize Vika and Talik. After my father died, my mother signed over her apartment to her grandson, thus bypassing me. When I asked her why she didn't leave the apartment to me, she said, "What difference does it make? Because Talik is my son." And in our conversation, she said that it was Vika who advised her to do that, and she even brought a notary. That was the first time I felt something wrong. 2 years later, my mother died. The apartment was rented out, and the money for housing went into my wife's pocket, for pins, as she liked to say. Everything was going well in my family. Until the moment I dialed my wife's number and accidentally interrupted her conversation with some unfamiliar man. At first I wanted to disconnect, but then the conversation interested me and I involuntarily pressed the record button on my phone. My beloved wife Vika was complaining to the stranger that she had no more patience and that she was ready to leave this boring idiot. I assumed this was about me at any time. Then she asked if the man she was talking to missed her son and if it was time to tell him everything. The man on the other end of the line hummed and said it would have to wait a little longer. And that was the end of it. Have you ever been bitten by a wasp, not just anywhere, but in the head? It was like being hit on the top of the head with a sledgehammer. I felt like I had been stung by a herd of wild wasps. A jackhammer was pounding in my head. My legs and arms felt cotton candy and I was out of breath. My first impulse was to tear the man's throat out and give my wife a good thrashing, at least to tell her everything. Then I gradually cooled down, realizing that this would do nothing for me and I would make nothing for myself but more trouble. I remember wandering for a long time through the wet autumn streets and listening to the tape over and over again. I seemed to have learned it by heart. My soul ached, and I wanted to raise my head and howl wolfishly into the emptiness of the autumn sky. Then I closed myself in my office, concentrated all my will to extinguish my emotions, and began to prepare the ways of withdrawal. Judging by the conversation with Vicky unknown to me so far, man, Talik is not my son. I arranged with the Bureau of Forensic Medicine, and secretly from my wife brought biomaterials for analysis. 3 days later, I knew for sure the answer. Yes, he was not my son. Oh yes, Vicky, white and fluffy. I now understand what was the cause of the hurry with our marriage. Vika got knocked up on the side, and she had to legalize her pregnancy at all costs. So she found a loser, me, to get her pregnant and quickly fooled him. Yes, my father must have thought something like that on a subconscious level, because he didn't like his future daughter-in-law right away. Apparently, the real daddy wasn't really looking forward to being a father at the time. But time flows and things change. Apparently Vika met him again. The old love carrot flared up, and there is a common son, The asshole had fulfilled his mission. It was time to throw him out and create a strong family of relatives. Reunite, so to speak. Why? The parents' apartment is in Tulix, hence Vika's name. Our apartment in a divorce will remain her, poor thing with a child. Knowing the gender and feminist bark of our courts. The car and all that too will be left to her. I'll get some change, and that if I'm lucky. That's it. I'm a bum. She's golden. She's with her lover, Talik's father, and I'm sleeping under a bridge. To be honest, at first I didn't even know what to do in this situation. I had some money because I was working. But like all husbands, I paid for the opportunity to have access to my wife's body by giving her almost my entire salary. A kind of mixture of an ATM machine and a vibrator. So my prospects for the future were still unclear. After learning the truth about the son, I decided to find out who her lover was and began to sort things out. And here I was in for a surprise. Her longtime lover, and therefore Talik's father, was my boss. I banal traced Vika, which she went ostensibly to visit another friend, and found that she was meeting with the dear Arkady Alexandrovich, director of the antique company Alliance, where I worked. So I got into the firm, and not for the pretty eyes. Yes, Vika. All calculated. Apparently, the plan from the beginning, and was so. Get the asshole a job to feed his son, and then we can kick his ass. That's a good multi-track. 16 years ago, Arkady was married, and the firm and all the money belonged to his wife. Of course, if he had cried divorce then, he would have been left with a naked ass. But now that his wife had died a year ago, he had only to settle some formalities of inheritance, and he would be reunited with the woman he loved and his son. Fortunately, and Vika has not sat idly by, during this time managed to get his hands on my parents' apartment, apparently as a compensation for living with me all these years. So the puzzle came together. Everything was in its place. Well, forewarned is forearmed. I didn't let on that I knew. Held as much as possible, trying to please everything and acquiesce to Vika, to lull her vigilance. I did everything I could to please the chief, like I was trying to prove my loyalty. Probably during meetings they laughed at me, anticipating the moment when they kicked me in the ass. And at that moment happened an event that fundamentally changed my life and inspired me to take further action. My father had worked all his life as an accountant at a lumber mill. He had only two enduring passions in life: numismatics and ancient Japanese poetry. Mother, like all wives, at one time tried to somehow fight this, as she said dope, but then gave up and left his father alone. My father would sit at his desk in the evenings and look through the coins. When he died, the collection was gone. No one paid much attention to it. My mother didn't care about it, and I was busy raising my family's fortune, so no one remembered the collection. And then one evening I got a phone call from my aunt, my father's sister. She and I talked briefly about some nonsense. I was in a depressed state and was not very talkative. Unexpectedly, Aunt Olia said that not long before his death, my father had given her a suitcase with a request to give it to me later. But she got distracted and forgot all about it. But today, she went to the mezzanine and found it in the pile of junk. It's locked, and she doesn't know what's inside. If I wanted it, I could take it anytime I wanted. To be honest, I didn't pay much attention to this conversation. I promised to stop by on occasion and get my inheritance that had fallen upon me so unexpectedly. 5 days later, I was in the area where my aunt lived and picked up my father's valise. I brought it to work and tried to open it. But it didn't work. The valise was made of thin titanium sheets and covered with leather. The only way to open it without a key was to use an autogene. But in that case, there was a risk of damaging the contents, especially since I didn't know what was inside. I don't know why, but I had an obsessive urge to find out what my father kept in the case. But where could I find the key? And then I began to ponder. If my father had left me the bag, he knew I would not open it without the key. so he was sure I'd find a key. I called Auntie Ola and asked if my father had left me anything else. Auntie Olia thought about it and said that she still had my father's address book. I immediately went to her, and she gave me an old leather-bound notebook. I found nothing interesting in the book, but on the cover I was interested in the numbers and letters written by my father. The numbers indicated my year of birth, and the letter before them began my name. A shiver ran down my spine. It was like a safe deposit box code. I tried to reason logically. My father had been walking badly for the last years. The effect of old trauma was evident. So he must have found a bank somewhere nearby. My father was a pedant and understood that he could not trust a fly-by-night commercial bank. Apparently, it was a state bank, which was less exposed to the conflicts of the market economy. So we had to look for it not far from our old apartment. An hour later, I entered the door of the end branch of the state bank. I was met by a pretty girl dressed in a black skirt and a white blouse with a green scarf around her neck. I explained the situation to her, and she, sweetly smiling, offered to wait for me, and she disappeared behind the door leading into the bowels of this temple of money. They brought me coffee, and I was surprised at such extraordinary service. In half an hour, a representative man came out to me and asked me to go with him. I found myself in a spacious office in the company of the head of the bank's security service and the senior cashier. They asked me for a code and then asked me to name my father's initials. After a while, a long, narrow box was brought into the office, opened, and left me alone. Inside the box, there was a bundle with a white metal ring with my father's initials, a small key, and a figure of a samurai armed with 2 Japanese swords. I tried the ring on, and it fitted like a mold on my ring finger on my right hand. The master of the office returned. I signed the papers for closing the safety deposit box and was escorted to the exit. Back at work, I inserted the key into the keyhole under the handle of my valise. The lock clicked and the valise opened. As expected, there were coins in the valise. When I laid them out on the table, having previously locked the door, I broke out in a cold sweat. Rarest Russian, Soviet, and foreign coins. Several Spanish Conquista-era maquins, a complete set of Soviet coins from 1958, Confederate Civil War-era banknotes and silver dollars, and last but not least, a very rare Russian coin, the Anna, and chain. All the coins had certificates of authenticity and documents confirming their legal ownership. Yes, it was a real treasure. I am not a beginner in the antique business, just stunned. At first glance, it was all pulling on the serious money and not at all Russian rubles. Frankly, I had the feeling that I was dreaming. I carefully put the coins in my valise and began to think about how to use the sudden wealth that had fallen on me to solve my difficult situation in life. I could just get a divorce. But those bastards had stolen 16 years of my life. Stole my unborn son. They robbed me of the joy of fatherhood, the joy of holding my child in my arms, my hair. In essence, they robbed me of the main purpose of a man, to leave behind offspring. And after all that, you can just walk away. The first thing I did was buy myself a car. I thought that a Porsche Cayenne would be the most appropriate option. I rented a parking space for 2 blocks from our family nest. You already know about buying a house in the historic part of town. The very next day, I hired a design and construction team from Belarus. A month and a half later, there was a new antique company and store in town. Needless to say that all my clients began to cooperate with the new firm. But the business of the firm alliance was getting worse and worse. Constant checks, customer churn to competitors, and other troubles suddenly fell on the poor head of her manager. Employees began to leave, and finally, even the CEO's secretary left. It was painful to look at Arkady Alexandrovich. He lost his former luster and was only a shadow of the once successful antique businessman. In the end, of all the employees in the firm, only I remained. Vika had changed too. Her evening outings were getting shorter and shorter. She showed unprecedented care and tenderness toward me. I continued to pretend that I knew nothing and played with rapture the role of fool cuckold. And finally, through front men, I bought a mansion for myself outside the city, built on the site of the ranger station, surrounded by a magnificent pine forest, and fulfilled the dream of my childhood. Got myself a purebred Central Asian shepherd. All this splendor was written down in the name of my aunt, who immediately executed a deed of gift for me. So the question of my new home was solved. It was time to end the comedy and move on to the final phase of the Operation Quasi-Loser. The moment came when the firm Alliance, because of overdue rent, was denied to rent the premises. The new antique firm had paid a large amount of rent, and Mr. Director of the Alliance was asked to vacate the premises within 3 days. Arriving at the firm on the last day, I called Vika and asked her to come to my office. She was surprised, but she complied. She and I went into the office, Arkady Alexandrovich. Vika felt something, but continued to play the role of an incomprehensible fool. We sat down at the table, and I silently laid out a bunch of photos illustrating love affairs of my wife and my boss. Believe me, there was a lot to see. You should have seen their faces. I even began to fear that Arkady Alexandrovich had a stroke. Vika sat with a stone face, and only her cheeks were tears. I even felt pity for her. And so, as not to give in to pity, I turned on the tape recorder and in the office sounded a dialogue between the two lovers about the prospects of a cuckolded lover who had fulfilled his mission. I did not want to disturb them from enjoying the recording, so I got up and headed to the door without turning around. Vitalik. Vicky's voice expressed a storm of emotions. Anger, disappointment, and finally, fear. Wait, you got it wrong. I did not turn around. Man, that's corny. I just had to hear, it's not what you think. I couldn't help but look up when I got to my car. From the window of the second floor, a weeping Vika and white as chalk ex-chief looked at me. I politely bowed, waved, turned off the alarm, and climbed into the driver's seat. For a moment, it seemed to me that the dangling samurai on the chain waved his swords and winked at me. I started the engine, drove off, and a few moments later joined the stream of cars that